About 1 in 5 Americans is illiterate. That is startling, and it's something that somebody might have told you. You might have seen it in some social media videos or even read it in some articles from fairly reputable sources. This Forbes article even says that over half of Americans read below a 6th grade level. These are shocking statistics that many people have reported. But are they even true? First of all, where do we even start when investigating some data like this? It's not like we get a reading test when we fill out the census every 10 years. Luckily, the Forbes article does include a source, a Gallup study for the Barbara Bush Foundation for Literacy. And this is that study, which you can download at the link in the description. So let's take a look at it. The first thing we notice is, of course, the title, and we see that it's about the economic benefits of improving literacy. So this isn't the Department of Education purely testing people to give the country a national literacy rating. The study looks at the different income levels for different levels of literacy, saying that the higher the literacy, the higher the average income. Therefore, it's good for families and our economy if we improve the literacy. But what is this level of literacy that they're actually looking at? Where did they get this information from? Because this study is not the one testing people's literacy levels. The actual study into the literacy rates was done by PIAAC. The data that most people cite, including the Barbara Bush Foundation, are from the first cycle of the Adult Skills Survey, which was done between 2012 and 2017 in the US. Keep that in mind because we'll come back to it and take a deeper look at the PIAAC data itself, but let's finish looking at the Gallup study first. So the Gallup study came up with its own definition of illiterate, saying that anything scored below a level 3 on the PIAAC test is considered illiterate. Now this is important because this is not how international communities define illiteracy. This is not how any country legally defines literacy for their national statistics. So if you Google what's the literacy of Spain or Japan or Singapore, they're not going to show you the PIAAC results the way this study pops up when you search literacy in the US. This definition was made by and for this very Gallup study on behalf of the Barbara Bush Foundation. Now let's look at this map from the study where the darker shade of green represents states that have more to gain economically from eradicating illiteracy. You'll see that a lot of the darkest states on this map are also some of the states with the lowest average income and highest rates of poverty. So even if the goal was to get everybody to the same level of literacy, they would naturally have the most to gain because they're starting from the lowest position. But that doesn't paint the whole picture because we have wealthy states like Texas, California, and New Jersey that also show a lot to gain. So what else do some of these other areas in darker green have in common? A high percentage of Hispanic residents. Just below the map, the study mentions some places with the highest amount of Latino immigrants as having the most to gain on an individual town basis, saying that 84% of McAllen's residents would score below level 3 and therefore be deemed illiterate by this study, which is coincidentally almost exactly the same as the proportion of Hispanic residents in McAllen, Texas. And for those who don't know, this is right on the border with Mexico. So a lot of these people are immigrants themselves or descendants of immigrants in the last 1 or 2 generations, where a lot of the people are likely to speak Spanish at home as their first language, especially in a town or county with such a high proportion of Spanish speakers. So is this report saying that immigrants can't read? Well, no, because it's not testing their individual literacy, it's testing their English literacy. What this study is really saying is this is the potential economic gains of people with an increased literacy in English, because despite the diversity of the US and having no official language, this is still a predominantly English-based society and economy. So the places with the most to gain are the ones that are already starting with the least and or the ones that have the highest proportion of people who don't speak English. And we also have to consider how accurate is this information anyway? How good was their sample size? They had a total of 12,330 participants in this study, which is actually a lot more than most studies would ever be able to get. But we have to keep in mind that this is in the context of being in the USA, a country that today has about 340 million people. Even if we go back and look at the population from 2017, when the last of this information was gathered, that's still less than 0.004% 4% of the population. And the information was gathered in only 185 counties out of over 3,100 in this entire country. And I'm not saying this number is inaccurate or this data is unusable. I believe this survey was really, really well done. It takes a lot of effort to get anything at that size, but it's also almost impossible to get anything that reliably and accurately portrays an entire population the size of the US. By the way, if you've made it this far into the video, you're probably interested in linguistics, so consider subscribing to see more. Now, I've already mentioned a couple times that this was done for the Barbara Bush Foundation for Family Literacy, which makes sense given the topic, but how should this affect the way we read this information? This is a foundation whose website literally says that literacy is the key to everything. So they have a vested interest in making their services seem as important as possible. Now, I'm not suggesting some conspiracy theory where they intentionally made the scores lower than they would have been so that they can get some more money. And of all the foundations that could make themselves seem important, I think most people would agree that literacy actually really is important. So what they're doing isn't exactly out of the ordinary or unethical in any way, but it's important to keep in mind the motivations behind the sponsoring of this study. The point of the Gallup study is showing the economic benefit to using the resources that the Barbara Bush Foundation has to offer, which could attract investors. And it made up its own definition of illiteracy to get to these startling percentages, a definition that isn't even echoed in the actual PIAAC study, which actually gathered the data and performed the tests. Not to mention, it considered anything below level 3 illiterate and anything level 3 and above to be fully literate, even though somebody could have gotten just at the bottom of level 3 or at the top of level 5, they are equally considered fully literate by this Gallup study. And even counting people who did test up to level 3, it says they lack certain proficiency or read below a 6th grade level. But what actually is a 6th grade level? I and my classmates in 6th grade were reading some pretty big books. Sure, we weren't reading scientific studies or financial reports, but still lengthy, complex stories. This is where we go back to the PIAAC data itself. The test gives a score between 0 and 500, and the cutoff for the top of level 2 is 275 points out of 500. So anything that scores 275 points and below is what the Gallup study deemed illiterate, but the PIAAC study gives no such definition. This level is defined as being able to understand and make inferences about things that aren't explicitly stated in lengthy or multiple texts. So reasonably complex stuff, but nothing too crazy. And while level 2 is obviously less advanced, it still has a lot of that same stuff, the ability to understand and infer several things. Yet according to the Gallup definition, somebody that scored a 275 is considered illiterate, but if they scored a 276, then they are considered fully literate, equally fully literate as somebody who scored 500 points. So there's another problem with the definition. But how do people from the US overall score in comparison to other countries? Here we see that the average score of the US is 270. That would make the average by the Gallup standards illiterate. But that's the same average as countries like Austria and Germany, and it's also above the OECD average, as well as countries like Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Spain, Italy, and even Singapore. Of course, it's a noticeable ways off the top, Japan standing out quite a bit from even second place. So more than advanced or illiterate, it looks like the US is just painfully average. And if we're going to say that 21% of Americans are illiterate or 54% can't read above a 6th grade level, then that same is also true for many other countries that most people would not consider to have high rates of illiteracy. It's also worth recognizing what kinds of groups were intentionally excluded from the survey. For the countries that used a population registry, which was most of them, they all excluded undocumented immigrants, as well as some of them excluding temporary residents or even all foreigners. And these are probably some of the groups that are the least likely to speak the local language that was being tested for. Whereas the US, as well as about a dozen other participating countries, used screeners, and the only groups that they excluded were mostly just inaccessible locations. Not to mention that a background survey was given to the participants to understand their demographics, and that was available in English and Spanish for the US, but the survey itself for literacy skills was only available in English. The US and Norway are the only two countries in this set that did not give the skills test in every language that was available for the background survey. So once again, they were testing English literacy specifically in some places that were mostly Spanish speaking. Another thing that could have played a role in this but isn't mentioned at all is dyslexia. There's not a single result for dyslexia in the PIAAC study. Yet there's research that shows us in English people have a higher rate and greater effects of dyslexia because English has a relatively complex and inconsistent spelling compared to places like Italy, where Italian has a much more consistent spelling. So dyslexia could have made it inherently more difficult to get a higher literacy score in the US, where they were only tested in English. Yet the US still managed to outscore countries that only tested in a language that is less affected by dyslexia. So we have the Gallup report that talks about the economic gains of literacy made for the Barbara Bush Foundation for Literacy, a place that would probably gain from making it seem like its services are needed. And they said the places that need it the most are the ones that are already starting with the least, or the ones who don't speak English. And that report made up their own definition of illiterate specifically for that report and nothing else. And when we look at the PIAAC data, we see that the US scores above average for OECD. We see that the US included groups that were excluded by other countries and perhaps less likely to speak the language that was tested for. And there's no mention of other complicating factors like dyslexia. So are 1 in 5 Americans actually illiterate? I'd say that you can say yes if we're using the Gallup definition of illiteracy, and if we assume that the results from the 12,330 participants is accurately being scaled up to represent a nation with a population that is about 27,000 times greater than the sample size was. And if that's true for the US, then that's also true for most other countries in the world. But if we're just gonna say are 1 in 5 Americans illiterate in general, no. Absolutely not. Most people in the US, as well as the entire world, know how to read and write a text message, read articles, scroll through social media, fill out paperwork for special documents, and read simple books. For a lot of people, that's enough and pretty much all they need. Some people that didn't learn to read might have been learning to farm or fish, provide food for their family and neighbors. Or they might be in a position where going to school was dangerous and they were never allowed to learn. They can still be brilliant, genius people. They just didn't learn that particular skill. But even then, almost everybody, especially in the US, can read to some level and read enough for what they need in their lives. And the US might not be especially good, but it's not especially bad either. In terms of literacy, besides a few very high achieving countries, the US is just about as literate as everybody else. If you made it to the end, thank you so much for watching the whole thing. If you enjoyed it, the best way to let us know is by liking the video and leaving a comment with what you enjoyed about it and what you might like to see for a future video. And the best way to support us to make sure we can keep making more videos like this is to subscribe and share. Hope to see you in the next one. Until then, my name is Carson, and remember, every accent, every language, every dialect, the way everybody speaks around the world are all equally valid and beautiful. Ciao.